Explore the unseen.
Imagine strapping yourself into, well, a metal can, right? Rocketing off our planet, leaving gravity completely behind, hurtling through the cosmos. It's the ultimate adventure, maybe the peak of human ambition. But while the destination is incredible, the journey itself, it comes at a significant biological cost. We're not just sending amazing machines into the void, we're sending human bodies, and perhaps most critically, human brains, into an environment they were, well, absolutely never designed for. What happens to our most complex organ when we leave Earth behind for extended periods? We're taking a deep dive today into a stack of sources you've shared with us, articles, research papers, roadmaps from space agencies, really trying to understand the hidden and sometimes surprising challenges space travel poses specifically to the brain.
And our mission here really is to be your guides through all this material. We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight so you don't have to pore over every single technical detail yourself. The core topic is the impact of these unique stressors, the spaceflight stressors, on the brain and on behavior. We have sources here covering, well, everything from molecular changes to big structural shifts, impacts on performance, and even potential long-term health risks. And understanding these effects isn't just academic, It's absolutely crucial as we plan for future long-duration missions. Think about a multi-year trip to Mars. It's way more demanding than current stints up in Earth orbit.
Okay, yeah. Let's really unpack this based on what's in these sources. They lay out several key environmental stressors in space. Microgravity is the obvious one, the lack of gravity pulling you down. But then there's also space radiation, the intense psychological challenge of isolation, confinement, disrupted sleep, right?
Yeah.
And even elevated levels of carbon dioxide inside the spacecraft. So let's start with that fundamental shift. What does microgravity seem to do to the brain's physical structure?
Well, what's absolutely fascinating from these sources is how the absence of gravity causes this substantial fluid shift upwards, towards the head. See, our bodies are used to gravity pulling fluids downwards. In space, that pressure is gone, and the fluid goes up. The sources show this leads to pretty significant changes in cerebrospinal fluid. That's the fluid bathing your brain and spinal cord. Specifically, you see ventricular expansion. That's an increase in the volume of the brain's internal fluid-filled spaces. Think of them like chambers inside the brain. The sources detail increases in the lateral, third, and total ventricular volume. There's also a global upward shift of the brain itself within the skull and a narrowing of those CSF spaces at the very top.
So the brain is literally shifting upwards inside the skull, and the fluid chambers inside it are getting bigger? That sounds, wow, incredibly intense.
It really is. And this structural change isn't just about fluid distribution either. The sources also detail changes in gray matter volume. Gray matter is where most of your brain's neurons are, involved in processing information. They found decreases in gray matter volume in areas sort of around the base of the brain, like the frontal lobes, temporal poles, parts of the hippocampus, areas linked to things like memory, emotion, complex thinking. But here's a surprising detail from the sources. Increases are seen in sensoromotor areas, like part of the cerebellum called the vermis, and areas involved in processing touch and movement called the paracentral lobule and prepostcentral gyrus. White matter, that's the wiring connecting different brain regions, also shows changes. Decreases in something called fractional anisotropy, which is a measure related to the structural integrity of those white matter pathways. And the sources link that to potential declines in sensoromotor and cognitive function.
Okay, how does all this structural weirdness inside the head actually translate to how astronauts function? How they perform crucial tasks. Does a physically shifted brain still work the same way?
Well, this raises a critical question the sources really wrestle with. Is this dysfunction, or is it some kind of adaptive plasticity? Some of these structural changes, like those increases in sensoromotor areas, could potentially be the brain adapting, maybe learning to move in a 3D microgravity environment, kind of rewiring itself for the new conditions. However, the sources make it clear these changes are also associated with declines in actual performance, particularly after they get back to Earth. For instance, sensoromotor function is significantly affected post-flight. It impacts crucial things like postural control, how they walk, how they move. Simple tasks needing precise hand-eye coordination, like manual tracking, can show higher error rates. Studies using tests like the functional mobility test show slower completion times after spaceflight. Now, that could reflect poorer physical mobility, or perhaps it's a trade-off where the brain sacrifices speed to maintain stability. And the sources also point out that spatial abilities, things like navigation, spatial mapping, really critical for exploring a new planet, appear particularly vulnerable.
Right. Okay, so microgravity messes with structure and function. But beyond that, what about radiation? We hear that being a huge risk, especially as we venture further out, away from Earth's magnetic shield, into deep space.
Oh, radiation is highlighted in the sources as one of the most significant and, frankly, one of the most poorly explored health risks, neurologically speaking, for deep space travel. The sources emphasize that even relatively low doses of certain types of radiation particles, particularly those high-energy heavy ions from galactic cosmic rays, GCRs, that are just everywhere in deep space, they can cause profound and potentially long-lasting changes in the brain. This isn't just about killing cells, it's damage at the molecular and neurobiological level. It leads to behavioral and cognitive deficits that have been documented in various studies, mostly animal models so far. Radiation can damage critical brain regions like the hippocampus and basal ganglia, which, as we mentioned, are essential for learning, memory, movement control, other cognitive functions. Animal models exposed to radiation levels equivalent to what you might get on a Mars mission show clear long-term cognitive deficits.
And is this temporary damage, or could it have serious long-term health consequences, maybe years after they're back on Earth?
The sources indicate potential long-term effects are a major concern.
Yes.
This includes things like an increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases, maybe premature aging of brain tissue, and even an elevated risk of brain tumors, especially for individuals who might be more vulnerable genetically. Radiation can also affect the brain's tiny blood vessels, the capillaries, potentially leading to issues like capillary hemorrhages, thickening of vessel walls, maybe an increased risk of things like microaneurysms or stroke over time. One striking detail from the sources is that radiation can even reduce the complexity of connections between brain cells. It can damage the delicate branches and spines of neurons that receive signals. There's an urgent call in these documents for more systematic research to really map out both the acute and the long-term central nervous system consequences. We just don't know enough yet.
Wow, that sounds incredibly challenging. What about the psychological side then? Long-term isolation, being confined in a small space with the same few people for months, maybe years. How do those factors impact the brain and behavior?
Yeah, long-term isolation and confinement are undoubtedly significant stressors, especially for missions extending far beyond the typical 6-month ISS stay. The sources draw heavily on analog studies here, simulations done on Earth, like the Mars 500 simulation where participants spent 520 days locked on a habitat, and research on scientific expeditions in extreme environments, like Antarctica. These studies show real measurable effects on the brain. The Mars 500 participants, for example, showed changes in white matter microstructure, those brain connection pathways we talked about. Antarctic studies reported reduced gray matter volume in key areas like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and parahippocampus. Those regions vital for memory, emotion, decision-making. They appear susceptible to this kind of environmental deprivation.
So just being isolated and confined, say in an extreme environment, can actually change the physical structure of parts of the brain?
Yes, that's what the research from these analogs strongly suggests. It's quite profound, really. These conditions can also affect something called hippocampal neurogenesis. That's the growth of new brain cells, specifically in the hippocampus. Animal models exposed to social isolation show a reduction in this process, which seems to impact both memory and social interaction behavior. Psychologically, isolation and confinement can lead to increased negativity, symptoms of depression, difficulties reintegrating into society after returning to Earth. One source mentions studies with retired cosmonauts noting increased confrontations or interpersonal issues post-mission. These psychological and behavioral issues are highlighted because they can seriously affect a crew's cohesion, their performance effectiveness, overall mission success, and they can definitely linger after the mission ends.
And what about just basic things like sleep? That must be tough, getting good sleep in space.
Oh, absolutely. Sleep deprivation isn't just about feeling tired, is it? It dramatically alters brain chemistry and function across various regions and networks. Our sources point to changes in brain networks involved in sustained attention, your ability to focus, and even the brain's default mode network. That's the one active when you're not focused on a specific task, involved in things like mind-wandering, self-referential thought. Combined with all the other mission stressors, lack of sleep can lead to impaired cognitive function, including poor judgment and significant mood deterioration. Vigilance and reaction time, both critical for mission ops, can suffer significantly. Interestingly, one source notes that microgravity itself has sometimes been associated with a reduction in disordered sleep events like apnea or snoring, which could be a sort of paradoxical positive effect in space, but overall sleep quality and duration remain a major challenge.
It really sounds like it's not just one single thing hitting the brain, but a brutal combination of all these stressors at once, potentially interacting with each other in complex ways, right?
Exactly. That's a key point. The research strongly points to observed brain changes being the result of cumulative exposure to multiple independent environmental stressors. And yes, they interact. There's even research exploring the impact of elevated CO2 levels, which is always present in spacecraft environments due to breathing. One study using a spaceflight analog with elevated CO2 showed greater negative effects on certain white matter areas when that CO2 was combined with simulated microgravity compared to simulated microgravity alone. The Human Research Program Roadmap explicitly outlines the need for studies looking at combinations, things like radiation exposure with sleep deprivation or radiation with isolation. Recognizing that understanding these interactions is critical for accurately assessing the risks for those long-duration missions.
Okay, so how do these combined effects show up in astronaut performance both while they're up there and right after landing?
Well, beyond the sensor motor issues like impaired balance and movement we discussed, the sources detail cognitive performance decrements. Studies under conditions simulating aspects of spaceflight show that core cognitive abilities like reaction time and vigilance are impaired. This cognitive hit can actually be faster and more extensive than physical performance decline, as highlighted in some ground-based studies comparing the two. We touched on this, but visuospatial abilities, things like your ability to navigate, understand maps, orient yourself in space, appear particularly vulnerable according to the sources. And this is absolutely critical for future missions where astronauts will need to explore and map complex, new environments like the surface of Mars. These documented effects really underscore why understanding the link between these observed brain changes and actual behavior is so vital for operational readiness and mission success far from Earth.
That's pretty sobering stuff. Is there any good news in the sources? Does the brain kind of bounce back once astronauts are back on Earth, or are these changes permanent?
There is evidence of recovery, which is definitely good news, yeah. But it's not uniform across all the changes, and that's a really key takeaway from this material. Behavioral and cognitive deficits sometimes show an accommodation period, even while they're still in space. Astronauts learn to cope or adapt to some degree. Structurally, the changes in gray matter volume and those fluid shifts around the brain, though not inside the ventricles, seem to recover progressively after returning to Earth. This recovery is often relatively complete within about 6 months, maybe a bit longer, even after missions that lasted up to a year.
Okay, so the fluid around the brain and the gray matter volume changes seem to mostly get back to normal. But what about those enlarged ventricles you mentioned earlier, those fluid-filled chambers inside the brain?
And here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps a bit concerning, according to these sources. The ventricular volume increases the expansion of those inner fluid chambers appear to persist for much, much longer. The data shows this persisting potentially up to a year or even more after return to Earth. Some astronauts in these studies showed ventricular expansion that was like 6% to 8% greater than what's expected from just normal aging in comparison groups on Earth. But one of the most critical, perhaps counterintuitive takeaways from these sources concerns experienced astronauts, people who've flown before. The data indicates that those who had shorter intervals, say less than 3 years between their missions, showed little to no ventricular expansion after their most recent mission. However, those with longer intervals, 3 years or more on Earth between flights, did show significant ventricular expansion on their subsequent mission.
Whoa, hang on. That is completely counterintuitive. You'd think that spending more time on Earth, giving your brain more time to recover between missions, would lead to less change on the next flight, not more.
It is a surprising finding from the data presented in these documents, absolutely. And it highlights the complexity of brain adaptation and recovery from spaceflight. It's not straightforward. It suggests we need much, much more research into long-term recovery, especially for these persistent structural changes, like ventricular expansion. It also raises important questions about what factors, including prior flight experience and the specific duration of recovery time on Earth, influence outcomes on subsequent missions. It's clearly not as simple as more time is always better. And it ties back to something else mentioned in the sources too, SANS symptoms, that spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, involving vision changes, swelling in the optic disc, often linked to those fluid shifts, and increased intracranial pressure have been shown to persist for over 2 years after a long-duration mission in some astronauts. So some effects are definitely lingering.
Okay, so given all these challenges, the structural changes, the cognitive impacts, potential long-term risks, these weird recovery patterns, what's actually being done about it, how are researchers and space agencies trying to mitigate these effects to ensure astronaut health and performance on those future multi-year journeys, like to Mars?
Right, there's active, urgent research into countermeasures, looking across the whole spectrum of stressors. To combat the headward fluid shifts, and potentially related vision issues, techniques like lower body negative pressure, or LBNP, are being studied and used. LBNP involves sealing an astronaut's lower body in a device and applying suction to pull fluid downwards, sort of mimicking gravity's pull on the lower body. It has a long history and seems promising for unloading cerebral structures, maybe reducing risks associated with fluid shifts and venous issues like blood clots. Artificial gravity, typically generated by spinning a spacecraft or habitat to create centrifugal force, is also seen as a potential best countermeasure for many physiological systems affected by microgravity. Although developing the technology for reliable, long-duration use in space is a major engineering challenge, obviously. For the psychological stressors, robust support systems are key. Extensive pre-mission training focused on resilience, team dynamics, and even automated psychological tools are being explored. These are particularly important for deep space missions, where communication delays with Earth will make real-time support difficult, maybe impossible. Researchers are also looking into things like dietary interventions, probiotics to support gut health, as the gut-brain axis is known to play a role in influencing mood and behavior.
And from a research perspective, how are they even studying this when you can't just send huge numbers of people to space for years at a time to collect data?
Yeah, that's a huge constraint. That's where space analog environments on Earth become absolutely crucial, according to the sources. Studies using head-down tilt bed rests simulate microgravity effects on the body and brain structure, function. Isolation studies are conducted in confined or extreme environments like simulated habitats or places like Antarctica to help understand the psychological and neurological impacts of isolation and confinement. There's a significant push in the research roadmaps to standardize methods like using the same MRI scanning protocols, the same behavioral assessments across these analogs and actual space flights. The goal is to make the data more comparable and build larger, more robust data sets. There's also a strong focus on developing biological markers or biomarkers, measurable indicators you can find in blood, saliva, other samples that could potentially predict how an individual's brain might respond to spaceflight stressors and what their neurobehavioral outcomes might be down the line.
Wow. It's incredibly clear from these sources that while the destination, space, is awe-inspiring, the journey itself imposes a significant biological toll, especially on the brain. The human body and brain are constantly adapting in this alien environment, sometimes in ways that might help short-term survival, but sometimes leading to changes that could impact performance during a mission and potentially have long-term health consequences.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight the remarkable complexity of these effects. From fluid shifts literally changing the brain's physical structure and position within the skull, to radiation impacting brain cells at a fundamental molecular level, and isolation altering key brain regions and psychological states. The fact that some structural changes, like that ventricular expansion, can persist long after returning to Earth, and that surprising finding about how the duration of recovery time between missions might influence subsequent effects not always in the way you'd expect it, truly underscores how much more there is to learn about the human brain's response to this unique environment.
It really makes you appreciate the incredible resilience and adaptability of the human body and mind, doesn't it? But also recognize the significant challenges that still need to be understood and addressed for those much longer journeys we're planning, like a mission to Mars or venturing further out into the solar system.
Indeed. Understanding the precise mechanisms behind these brain effects and developing truly effective countermeasures is paramount for the safety and success of future human space exploration. It's arguably one of the most critical frontiers in space medicine right now.
So based on everything we've unpacked from these sources today, here's something to think about. If long-duration spaceflight, and even the time spent back on Earth between missions, can alter the brain in measurable ways that persist sometimes counterintuitively, what does that tell us about the fundamental, deep relationship between gravity, the environment we live in, and the very structure and function of our minds? How adaptable are we really when pushed to such absolute biological extremes? And what are the ultimate biological limits of our reach into the cosmos?